The Essence of Time by Selden Cummings. Time is an important, albeit frustrating concept, and for those of us who deal with time on a daily basis, that is to say, all of us, it is easy to forget the complexity that hides behind the simple ticking of the clock. Indeed, the subject of time and all that it entails has remained a major component of artistic, philosophical, and scientific thought for millennia, and even today the concept is not fully understood. From Aristotle to Newton and Einstein, from Plato on through Descartes and Nietzsche, the concept of time has been studied by some of the greatest minds in human history, and these studies and philosophies have, understandably, yielded mixed results. After all, time is not a physical thing. It is not a chemical that will offer predictable results when it is heated or cooled. It cannot be poked and prodded in a laboratory, nor can it be placed under a microscope to be examined. It can be measured, of course, but only by objects that are simultaneously passing through it as they measure it, and only in arbitrary measurements that we create. Truly, time seems more elusive and difficult to understand than most scientific concepts, despite the fact that we live our entire lives in its grasp. And although various scientists and philosophers throughout the years have concocted definitions of time that are as interesting as they are varied, none so far have been able to successfully offer a definitive explanation of the phenomenon that led them all to their graves. Therefore, it seems perfectly reasonable to assume that if this strange, deceivingly simple concept were approached from a different standpoint, then some of its secrets might be unlocked. A poet, for example, might have better luck studying the nature of time through a combination of comparisons and wordplay, or perhaps by studying time's antithesis, eternity, than a scientist would in a laboratory. Poets like William Shakespeare have offered countless meditations on the nature of time, while poets like John Keats have been able to capture the experience of life in time. Specifically, Shakespeare's untitled Sonnet 60, along with Keats's Ode on a Grecian Urn, both explore the nature of time as it can be experienced from various perspectives. Although these poems focus on different aspects of the nature of time, they both offer fascinating interpretations to explain temporal phenomena from both subjective and objective perspectives, successfully capturing the essence of time as it is experienced by humans on a daily basis. In order to understand why the interpretation of time in both Shakespeare's and Keats's poems is successful, we must examine our current understanding of the nature of time itself, or lack thereof. According to the concise Oxford English Dictionary, time is defined as the indefinite continued progress of existence and events in the past, present, and future, regarded as a whole. This basic dictionary definition of time is similar to most dictionary definitions of the concept, such as the one employed by Webster's Dictionary Classic Edition, which states that time is the duration of all existence, past, present, or future. The problem with these definitions is that they are circular. They utilize components of time, such as the past, the present, and the future, in order to define time itself. In other words, they fail to define time from an outside perspective, instead relying on words which are synonyms or consequences of the word being defined, like duration and progress, in order to define the thing itself. Unfortunately, even after thousands of years of study, we do not seem to be any closer to defining time in a non-circular manner. Time's indefinability is perhaps best summed up by physicist Samuel A. Goudsmit and journalist Robert Claiborne in the book Life Science Library, Time, which states that although a psychologist, a physicist, and a philosopher might understand time in different ways, and though they may write books about time, none of them can define it in a way satisfactory to one another, or even to themselves. Clearly, time is neither easy to define nor is it easy to understand, but fortunately, physics, psychology, and philosophy are not the only fields that have dealt with this issue. Poetry, with its powerful metaphors, startling wordplay, and crisp observations, seems better equipped to offer a definition, or at the very least an interpretation, of this concept that is so difficult to grasp. Shakespeare, in Sonnet 60, has managed to supply a study of time that one would be hard-pressed to find in any conventional physics textbook. The simplest interpretation of Sonnet 60 is that it is a poem about the nature of time. While this interpretation is true, the poem is also so much more than that. In a mere 14 lines, Shakespeare manages to capture the essence of time as it is experienced in a human life, while simultaneously blending various images and metaphors to create a poem that is as beautiful as it is accurate. The poem opens with a simile comparing the minutes that make up time to waves breaking upon a rocky beach. Like as the waves make towards the pebbled shore, so do our minutes hasten to their end. This comparison serves as the basis for the main theme of the poem, which is the nature of time and, more specifically, the consequence or end result of time as experienced by humans. The end result, in this case, is death, or the end toward which our minutes hasten. Though this truth is a morbid one, Shakespeare does not at first present it as such, paradoxically comparing the mortal minutes of our doomed lives with the gentle lapping of waves upon a pebbled shore. This comparison is quite apt, however, since the process of human aging and death, though not pleasant, is a typically gradual experience, much like that incessant breaking of the waves. Thus, Shakespeare opens his poem with a simple truth. Because of the nature of time, our lives are slowly coming to an end. As the poem progresses, however, the metaphorical language used to express the idea that time is responsible for our eventual deaths grows darker. Compared to the first quatrain, which uses the constant breaking of waves as an image to define time, the rest of the sonnet's body is quite grim. The second quatrain describes a human life as it progresses from birth to maturity and tells us that time will eventually destroy the gift of youth, which it bestows upon a person at birth. The third quatrain, which continues the idea that time destroys youth, goes on to say that time feeds on the rarities of nature's truth, and nothing stands but for his scythe to mow. These lines compare time with two different frightening monsters. The first line likens time to a hungry animal that eats the unique and beautiful aspects of the natural world, while the second line personifies time as a man with a scythe, ready to mow down anything that stands. In our modern era, this second image is familiar as the personification of death, also known as the Grim Reaper, who is usually pictured wearing a dark hood and carrying a scythe. The idea of Father Time is another form of this personification, and the form to which Shakespeare was most likely referring. In his book, Shakespeare's Sonnets and Narrative Poems, critic A.D. Cousins writes that Shakespeare's speaker most often and most dramatically presents time as Father Time. Of course, Shakespeare's Father Time is just as closely associated with death as is our Grim Reaper, except that the Reaper is associated solely with the concept of life's demise, whereas Father Time symbolically controls its beginning, continuation, and ending. Interestingly, this personification of time, with which Shakespeare was clearly familiar, evolved from the mythological figure of Kronos, the Greek titan who devoured his children in order to avoid being usurped by them. Psychologist Warren Coleman, in his article Tyrannical Omnipotence in the Archetypal Father, tells us that after displacing his own father, Kronos attempts to prevent the same fate befalling him by eating all his children as soon as they are born. With this gruesome image in mind, it is easy to imagine the final lines of Sonnet 60's third quatrain as a reference to Kronos, a titan who was frequently pictured with a sickle or scythe and who fed on his own children, children who might be described as the rarities of nature's truth. The sonnet, however, does not end there, but continues into a couplet which changes the poem's direction. And yet to times in hope my verse shall stand, praising thy worth, despite his cruel hand. Here Shakespeare, as the poet or speaker of the sonnet, speaks to future generations, times in hope, saying, despite the fact that time shall destroy youth and devour all things, the poet's verse will live on, extolling the virtues of the poem's recipient long after both the poet and said recipient have perished. In other words, the hand of the poet in writing the sonnet shall defeat or overcome the cruel hand of time. This sonnet is a beautiful, albeit frightening interpretation of life in time, all the more disconcerting because of its accuracy. In contrast, John Keats's poem Ode on a Grecian Urn examines a world where things will never perish. Where Shakespeare's Sonnet 60 succeeds in explaining time as it is experienced by humans, Keats's poem does the opposite. Instead of focusing on the passage of time and the inevitable doom of all living creatures, Keats, inspired by static images chiseled onto an ancient Grecian urn known as the Sisyphus vase, describes a world out of time, where people and things do not change. Eternity, in this sense, could be defined as the opposite of time, since a world in time is always changing, whereas an eternal world is never changing. In our case, it could be useful to define time by its opposite, though Keats was not likely trying to do so. Unlike Shakespeare's sonnet, evaluating humanity's temporal experience was probably not Keats's goal, at least not centrally. Instead, Keats focuses on the experience of viewing art and the knowledge and beauty that certain artistic pieces can possess even centuries after being created. Truly, this seems to be the main focus of Keats's ode, as expressed by Professor Earl Wasserman, who writes that the poem's intention must be to hold up art as the source of the highest form of wisdom. Poems, however, can have many functions, and though the central goal of Keats's ode seems to have been to praise the power and or beauty of art, he does so by presenting the idea of time as a slow or non-existent phenomenon. Indeed, the ode's opening lines speak of the passage of time as a slow thing. Thou still unravished bride of quietness, thou foster child of silence and slow time. The thou in these lines is directed at the urn, which Keats is personifying both as a virgin, unravished bride, and as the adopted child of slow time. These lines set the stage for a poem focused on an object that has depicted static scenes of human interaction in total silence for hundreds of years. Keats describes in detail each of these scenes as the ode progresses. Since each scene is chiseled permanently onto the urn and is therefore unchanging, Keats writes about the scenes as if the settings and characters in each were eternal. In the second stanza, wherein a bold lover chases a fair youth, the poet tells the lover not to despair, for although he shall never catch the maiden, forever wilt thou love, and she be fair. In other words, despite the fact that the lover, carved upon the urn in the midst of a permanent chase, will never lay hands on the object of his lust, he will, at the very least, never lose sight of her beauty. Similarly, the next stanza speaks of trees whose leaves will never wrinkle and fade, as they have been cast into eternity by being chiseled onto the urn. Ah, happy, happy boughs that cannot shed your leaves, nor ever bid the spring adieu. Spring, which is a seasonal archetype that symbolizes rebirth, youth, and growth, would never turn to summer or autumn on the Grecian urn. On the contrary, these trees upon the urn shall never lose their leaves, and therefore never experience the emptiness and death symbolized by the archetype of winter. In the fourth stanza, Keats writes of the coming sacrifice of a cow and how a small village is emptied one pious morn to attend this sacrifice. And, little town, thy streets for evermore will silent be. The little town on the urn has been deserted, and therefore in this eternal, unchanging scene shall never be filled with people again. Only in the final stanza does the poet lament the power of real time as it is experienced by humans outside of the urn's eternal grasp. He compares the never-ending promise of the urn with the gradual demise of his generation. When old age shall this generation waste, thou shalt remain in midst of other woe than ours. Here the poet takes a melancholy turn, writing that although he and his generation shall perish in the face of old age, the urn will live on to see the pain and suffering of the next generation. But there is hope yet, since the purpose of the urn, as outlined in the poem's final lines, is to inform future generations that beauty is truth, truth beauty. That is all ye know on earth and all ye need to know. This final line reflects Keats's likely goal, which, as outlined above, is to praise the beauty found in art. Keats takes this idea a step further by equating beauty with truth and finishing the poem with the idea that this truth, which is therefore beautiful, is all we need to know. Obviously, this poem approaches the idea of time very differently than Shakespeare's Sonnet 60, but because both of these poems deal with the concept of time in fascinating and metaphorical ways, a comparison of the two pieces can be used to develop a greater understanding of the nature of time itself. By placing Sonnet 60 and Ode on a Grecian urn side by side, we can see that the poems offer an interpretation of time based on their opposing descriptions of the concept. One of the central ideas of Shakespeare's poem is that time is simultaneously capable of giving and taking away. This is summed up in the second stanza's final line, "And time that gave doth now his gift confound." This idea that time is both creator and destroyer is reflected in its opposite sense in Keats's Ode. In other words, Keats removes time from the world of his poem, allowing the world of the urn to fall into a sort of limbo between creation and destruction, or, in the example of the urn's bold lover, between desire and satisfaction. The bold lover will never achieve his prize, but he will never lose sight of his prize either, and therefore he is caught in an eternal moment between the act of wanting the maiden and actually catching the maiden. Where Shakespeare writes of a world that contains both beautiful and terrible things, Keats writes of a world in which beauty is cemented and will never change. In the sonnet, time feeds on the rarities of nature's truth, and according to the ode, beauty is truth, truth beauty. In Shakespeare, time destroys nature's truth, which, according to Keats, is beautiful. Thus, when paired together, these poems contend that time is a destroyer of beauty. Again, Keats presents this idea with a description of eternity, wherein beauty does not change. If, in eternity, beauty does not change, then, consequently, beauty will change if it is removed from that eternity. The limbo of eternal life occurs multiple times in Keats's Ode, as with the trees that will never bid farewell to the spring. The trees have been created, yes, but now they are stuck between the event of their creation and the event of their destruction. They are static. Time cannot affect them. In contrast, the world that Shakespeare describes is constantly, relentlessly moving towards a conclusion. Indeed, the very progression of Shakespeare's poem reflects the progression of life that it is describing. The truths that the poem posits seem to grow worse and worse as the lines hasten towards their end, in the same way that life seems to grow worse and worse as time moves forward in the poem. The body of the poem opens with the image of a calm, pebbled beach and ends with the personification of time, scythe in hand, violently mowing down our lives. Keats's ode, on the other hand, describes the same unchanging world in almost every stanza, using similarly constructed stanzas in order to create this world. All of the stanzas in Keats's ode are nearly identical to one another in their loose iambic pentameter, along with their rhyme schemes, which vary between A-B-A-B, C-D-E, C-D-E, and C-D-E, D-C-E as the poem progresses, depending on the stanza in question. Thus, in this sense, the relatively static form of the ode reflects the urn that it is attempting to describe. There are changes in the scenes on the urn just as there are changes in rhyme scheme in each stanza, but the overarching theme of each scene described is the same, in the sense that each scene is eternal, just as the overarching meter of each stanza is the same. Similarly, Shakespeare's poem, though its darkening descriptions reflect the subject of the sonnet itself, uses the same meter throughout. Truly, in meter and rhyme, Keats's ode is quite similar to the form of sonnet which Shakespeare perfected, known eponymously as the Shakespearean sonnet. This form utilizes 14 lines arranged in 3 quatrains and a couplet written in rhymed iambic pentameter. The body of the sonnet is arranged in an A-B-A-B, C-D-C-D, etc. rhyme scheme, while the 2 ending words of the lines in the couplet rhyme with each other, usually as G-G. In her book, The Art of Shakespeare's Sonnets, scholar and critic Helen Vendler writes that Sonnet 60 is one of the perfect examples of the 4-4-2 Shakespearean sonnet form. Indeed, Sonnet 60 follows this description of a Shakespearean sonnet almost absolutely, from the ABAB rhyme scheme to the overall structure, using 3 quatrains and a couplet. Both Keats's ode and Shakespeare's sonnet utilize similar rhyme schemes and meters in order to convey the nature of the worlds they are trying to describe. The form that each poet employs is thus well equipped to help us complete our comparison of these poems as they relate to the nature of time. Shakespeare and Keats employ familiar poetic meters and rhyme schemes in order to convey worlds that are both recognizable and strange. In the book Time, the Familiar Stranger, philosopher J.T. Fraser writes that although the passage of time is intimately familiar, the idea of time is strangely elusive. This sentiment is reflected in Shakespeare's sonnet and Keats's ode, both of which at once seem familiar and strange. Sonnet 60 is familiar in its ultimate explanation of time, since we have all experienced the process of aging and understand that death awaits us all. Keats's ode is similarly familiar in its descriptions of human life and nature, as the bold lover chases the fair youth, as the trees appear in the springtime, and as the villagers participate in a religious ritual. The familiarity of each poem becomes strange, however, when Shakespeare employs metaphor and Keats employs the idea of eternity. For example, when Shakespeare imagines time as an animal devouring nature's beauty, he offers us an image of time as a monster, simultaneously unfamiliar in its description, yet accurate in its comparison. The familiar settings that Keats describes are similarly made unfamiliar by the eternity in which such scenes are placed. We can relate to both the desire of the lover and the fear of the maiden, but we cannot relate to their eternal, unchanging lives. Both poets succeed in offering descriptions of temporal phenomena by capturing the intimate yet elusive nature of time. They do this objectively, as when Shakespeare uses waves to symbolize time, and subjectively, as when Keats describes the personal feelings of the lover removed from time, caught in his unending chase. Ultimately, these poems succeed in describing what time is, or what time is not. We may never be able to define time without circularity, but we can surely explain it and understand it at an emotional level. These poems succeed in helping us do just that. On one hand, Shakespeare utilizes perfectly accurate comparisons and images in order to describe how we as humans experience time on a daily basis. On the other hand, Keats's description of familiar scenes in the grasp of eternity succeeds in offering an interesting depiction of time as described by its opposite. Both poems help us come to the conclusion that time is change, whether that change is defined by waves incessantly replacing each other or by the lack of change in a never-ending scene. We measure time by seconds and minutes, hours and days and weeks and months and years, and yet we cannot seem to capture the moments between the seconds, or the moments between those moments. Poems like Sonnet 60 and Ode on a Grecian Urn help us to capture those moments by creatively abstracting them, placing them in unfamiliar settings, or examining them through beautiful comparisons. Though we may never fully understand the nature of time, scientifically, philosophically, or psychologically, we can at least appreciate poetic interpretations of the concept as they relate to our lives and perhaps be content with those interpretations. After all, life is short, and these interpretations, at the very least, are quite beautiful. Thus, if we allow ourselves to enjoy these poems and these moments, then, perhaps, we will never run out of time. Thank you.